afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Robin Chamberlain, the Associate Director of the Center for African Studies. And I'm being told to speak louder. Can you hear me back there? Okay, good. I want to thank Halil and the Center, the Abbasi Center, and the Center for Human Rights for putting this panel on. It's really exciting to think about how scholars can come together and talk about current day issues on the continent of Africa, but in particular Sudan, and what we might acknowledge as things that we can do to help, but also look at events from a historical perspective and discuss them. So I am delighted to introduce both of our speakers. We have Dr. Christopher Tounsel, who is an historian of modern Sudan, with special focus on race and religion as political technologies. His first book, Chosen Peoples, Christianity and Political Imagination in South Sudan, published with Duke University Press in 2021, explores the way that Southern Sudanese intellectuals used Judeo-Christian scriptures to frame their revolutionary work against the Sudanese state. His second book, Bounds of Blackness, African Americans, Sudan, and the Politics of Solidarity, with Cornell University Press 2024, unpacks the vacillating approaches that African Americans have taken to the Sudanese state and its multi-ethnic populace through periods defined by colonialism, post-colonial civil wars, genocide in Darfur, and South Sudanese independence. Dr. Tounsel's articles have appeared in journals including the Journal of Religious History, Journal of African American History, Journal of Eastern African Studies, and Journal of Africana Religions. In addition to his research, Professor Tounsel has provided commentary on current events in Sudan and South Sudan for outlets including the BBC, Al Jazeera, Human Rights Watch, and NPR's Throughline. We also have Dr. Laetitia Bader, who is a Deputy Director in the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch, supervising the work on the Horn of Africa and the Sudan. She has worked for over a decade at the organization, where she has investigated conflict-related abuses, including abuses against children, internally displaced persons in Somalia, and sexual exploitation and abuse by the AU peace support forces there, and focused on issues of political repression, including mistreatment of political detainees, and in recent years supported conflict-related work on both Sudan and Ethiopia. Before joining Human Rights Watch, she worked on the rights of human rights defenders in the East and Horn of Africa region, and worked at the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Uganda. She holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and Sciences Po in Paris, specializing in human rights, and holds a bachelor's in history from University College London. She is bilingual in French and English, and she speaks Italian. It's nice to meet you. So, join me in welcoming them both.
Would you like me to stand or?
Thank you.
Okay.
Whichever you prefer.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you about this very important issue facing the world right now, which is the crisis in Sudan, and many thanks to all of the units who helped facilitate this discussion. So at least 15,000 Sudanese have been killed since the outbreak of the conflict. More than 8 million have been displaced, creating the world's worst displacement crisis. 25 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. And Sudan now dons the unenviable mantle of being the hungriest country on earth. So what is the historical background that led to this war? Why has the media been so silent? And what might one community's response to the conflict expand our understanding of the media's present and future role in shining light on the humanitarian crisis? So to begin, it's really important to know that the contemporary trauma did not emerge in an historical vacuum. Sudan, since becoming independent in 1956, has had more coups than any other African nation. Coups have occurred in 1958, 1969, 1985, 1989, 2019, and 2021. The 1989 coup brought Omar al-Bashir to power for a 3-decade autocratic rule in which Sudanese civilians suffered from the typical excesses of strongman rule. So secret police, fierce crushing of resistance, and corruption. Bashir's 2019 ouster was shocking to many observers who assumed that he would cling to power for the rest of his life or be forcibly removed by assassination. But any hopes of his downfall would result in democracy were short-lived, as in 2021, when elections were slated to be held, the army decided to take power for itself, claiming that it was stepping in to avert civil war. And so the current conflict revolves around two rival groups, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces. Since the 2021 coup ended a transitional government put in place after Bashir's removal, Sudan has been run by the army, with coup leader General Abdel Fattah Burhan as the state's de facto ruler. The Rapid Support Forces, led by General Mohammed Dagalo, who goes by the shorthand Hemeti, had worked alongside the SAF to help keep the military in power. Following Bashir's removal, the political transition was supposed to result in elections by the end of 2023, with Burhan promising a transition to civilian rule. But it appears that neither Burhan nor Hemeti has any intention of relinquishing power. The two men disagreed over how Rapid Support Force paramilitary should be incorporated into the army, and tensions boiled over after the RSF began deploying members around the country and in Khartoum without the army's express consent. And added to these tensions was concern over the RSF seeking to control more of the country's economic assets, including its very lucrative gold mines. And the power struggle exploded last April when the RSF and SAF began engaging each other in gunfights in the capital Khartoum and elsewhere. Now, who are these two men, Hemeti and Burhan? Well, Hemeti rose to power within the Rapid Support Forces beginning in the early 2000s, when he was at the head of the militia known as the Janjaweed, a group responsible for human rights atrocities in Darfur. And while then President Omar Bashir was the face of the violence, and of course has subsequently been indicted by the International Criminal Court for his crimes against humanity, the ICC also held the Janjaweed responsible for alleged acts of genocide. As the Janjaweed was engaged in its atrocious behavior, Hemeti rose up the ranks. And as head of the RSF, he has faced accusations of overseeing the bloody crackdown of pro-democracy activists, including the massacre of 120 protesters before the 2019 coup. Now, as bad as Hemeti has been, Burhan has not exactly been a saint either. Human rights groups have criticized his actions, and as head of the army and as Sudan's de facto head of state for the last 2 years, well, going on 3 years, Burhan has overseen a crackdown of pro-democracy activists as well. And so each appear to be obstacles to any chance of Sudan transitioning to civilian democracy. Now, while some elements of the crisis that, certainly do distinguish it from earlier conflicts in the country, and I think the main distinguishing feature of what's gone on since April 2023 has been the destruction that Khartoum itself has experienced. In other ways, the war is not entirely unprecedented in Sudanese history. The army has long been at the center of political transitions in Sudan, and resistance to civilian rule has more or less been the norm since 1956. Amid such authoritarianist tendencies, mass violence and human rights atrocities are not uncommon in post-colonial Sudan. But amid many of the atrocities that have taken place on the ground, one of the atrocities of the Sudanese conflict has been the media's coverage of Sudan relative to other ongoing crises. According to the analytics firm Chartbeat, news coverage from Sudan peaked around April 2023, the very month that the conflict exploded. That month, roughly 3,000 media companies across 70 countries published 7,000 new articles on Sudan. However, from January to May 2024, the number of new Sudan-related articles plummeted to just 600 per month. So that's from, again, 7,000 in April 2023 to averaging 600 by May 2024. Now, by comparison, as these graphs show, coverage of the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza have not gone below 100,000 per month at any point during the same time period, right? So we're talking about 1,000% difference, right? And so to what then may we attribute this startling imbalance of coverage? Well, to many, the answer is clear. Clean, old-fashioned racism. Last month, World Health Organization Director Tedros Ghebreyesus blamed the world's neglect of Sudan on racism, telling the BBC that he did not believe that Sudan was getting appropriate attention, and that the same was true of other cases in Africa. Saying, quote, "I think race is in play here. That's what I feel now. We see the pattern now," end quote. Representative Jamal Bowman of New York's 16th Congressional District stated that, quote, "We always uplift and talk about and center the Western hegemonic imperial power structure, which tends to be white nations like Israel and Ukraine and others," end quote. Conversely, Congressman Bowman added that situations in majority Black and brown countries are ignored or suppressed as part of a white supremacist narrative. Representative Sidney Kamlager-Dove, who represents California's 37th Congressional District, way further south in Los Angeles County, opined that Africa always seems like an afterthought, and she labeled the situation in Sudan as tragic. Representative Kamlager-Dove's words about Africa's apparent irrelevance are particularly striking given the fact that she is a member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Writing in Forbes magazine, Cameroonian-American journalist Janice Asare opined that lack of media coverage for crises impacting darker-skinned people could be attributed to the media industry's racial empathy bias, which essentially postulates that prejudice resulting in decreased sentiment for Black people's pain as compared to the suffering of their non-Black counterparts. Amid the perception that racism is responsible for the media's lack of coverage, as a historian of Sudan, it's hard not to see the irony that a country long known as the proverbial land of the Blacks has always occupied a racially ambiguous status in Western racial epistemologies. Mahmoud Mamdani has noted that the transatlantic slave trade racialized notions of Africa and fueled the conceptual tendency to envision the Sahara as the continent's dividing line, right? That the Sahara was a type of civilizational barrier, right? Below which lay Negro Africa, true Africa, or real Africa. Right? Hegel's writings exemplified the emphasis on slavery's role, in demarcating the separation, deeming Africa proper to be the land where enslaved peoples were captured, Northeast Africa as the land of the Nile, which he somehow, some way linked with Asia, and North Africa as, quote, European Africa. Under such delineations, the boundaries defining true Africa from other degrees of Africanness are deeply historical in nature and defined by the legacies of slavery and race. For those with the Hegelian propensity to detach North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa, lack of consensus regarding Sudan's regional positioning is further complicated by its centuries-old Arab and African heritages. By 1939, none other than sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois typified Sudan's nebulous perception when he penned the following words in his essay entitled Black Folk Then and Now, quote, "In what is known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, the Sudan is left as a sort of historical no man's land and is now regarded as Arabian, now as Egyptian, and always is not worth careful investigation," end quote. But one demographic was and has been and continues to be invested in approaching Sudan as an example of Black excellence, and that is African Americans. Decades before Du Bois penned those words, Black Americans were attracted to the ancient Nile and its Egyptian and Sudanic kingdoms. In the 19th century, Black authors looked to ancient Kush and Nubia as important to understanding their cultural predecessors. And this history of power gave context to those Black writers who claimed the right to possess civilization and culture against the broader context of slavery and humiliation. And while the ancient Nile still wields symbolic import for many African Americans, the community's attention to Sudan is not confined to its ancient past. Beginning with the early 20th century and continuing through the Obama presidency, my second book, Bounds of Blackness, African American Sudan and the Politics of Solidarity, explores this history of African American engagements with modern Sudan. Sudan is an important example of how malleable transnational racial solidarity can be when socio-political changes occur in a single space over time. In the African American purview, Sudanese colonialism and independence has presented different racialized heroes and villains. And this development is important for showing the capricious nature of racial solidarity and Black America's relationship with the Arab world beyond Palestine. In telling this history, I feature a variety of individuals and organizations, including Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, Eslanda Robeson, U.S. Foreign Service worker Arthur McCaw, whose papers are housed on campus at Stanford Special Collections Library, right? And Susan Page, a Chicago-born African-American woman who served as the first U.S. ambassador to South Sudan. Right? But notwithstanding each of these individuals, no single character looms larger in the history of Black America's relationship with Sudan than the luminous giant known as the Black press. Throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, African American newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, and the Final Call were the richest arenas to explore Black opinion on the modern Nile. While Sudan's colonial period, during Sudan's colonial period, Black newspapers often framed Sudan as Black racial kin under race-based state oppression. Following World War II, Black editorials speculated on Sudan's uncertain political future. When it became independent in 1956 and evolved into its first civil war, Black newspapers were there to report on the conflict. And at the turn of the 21st centuries, periodicals like the Nation of Islam's Final Call to Howard University's Hilltop Student newspaper reported on the genocide in Darfur. And so as traditional Black media brands like Jet and Ebony have declined or disappeared altogether, online news media like The Griot and The Root have continued the legacy of providing Black American audiences with Sudan-related content. Through it all, the diversity of Black print spaces that Black writers speaking on Sudan provided a particular definition of what it meant to be Black in the diaspora, and with it, a broader story about Black struggle, pride, and consciousness. Importantly, the Black press's coverage of Sudan since April 2023 provides, I think, an important texture to the argument that a racist media is blamed or is to blame for its relative non-coverage of the current crisis. Since last April, several major African American media outlets have kept eyes on Sudan. News1.com, which is owned by the same digital media platform that runs sites like Gossip, Madame Noir, and Black Planet, reposted my explainer on the conflict last April within days that the war erupted. The conflict has been covered by The Root, a popular Black culture and news site founded by Dr. Henry Louis Gates. BET.com, which posted, I think, a pretty good explainer on the war this past summer. The Final Call, which has provided several articles for its Black Muslim readership, and The Griot, which published its Sudan-related interviews with Representatives Bowman and Kamlager-Dove. Political commentator Roland Martin, who has over 1.4 million subscribers on his YouTube channel, devoted space on his show earlier this year to discuss Sudan. And Blavity.com helped to promote a benefit show for Gaza and Sudan featuring singer and rapper Black. Quote, "I love being Black and I promote being Black," he once shared. "And if something isn't right in the Black community, I'm speaking about it not being right. All we can do when things are crazy and all over the place is raise awareness," end quote. And then, of course, there is the platform formerly known as Twitter. One post with the phrase, "All eyes on Sudan," has been seen by over 3 million people. And the hashtag Eyes on Sudan has helped raise awareness for millions of others. Black Americans have long used such sites like Twitter as spaces for political engagement and social activism. And according to Pew Research Center surveys, Black social media users are particularly apt to convey that they find such sites important for them for getting involved with issues that they care about. While the Sudanese diaspora should be credited primarily for the success of hashtag Eyes on Sudan, it is important to note that African Americans have engaged with Sudan on X as well. And perhaps the most notable example comes from Grammy-nominated R&B artist Summer Walker, who posted a lengthy statement on X last November, a small portion of which appears here, that included a call for an end to the war in Sudan. And Summer Walker has approximately 2 million followers. So in conclusion, there is a war taking place in Sudan. It is horrible and it is historically rooted. But while it is important to critique Western media for its underreporting, it is also important to recognize that certain communities, including African Americans, are keeping our eyes on Sudan in the spirit of the transnational Black protest tradition. Mainstream media's scant coverage of Sudan may indeed be racist, but this should not take away from the ways that Black media producers and consumers are doing their part to raise awareness of Sudan. In condemning the media, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you.
And then we'll just wait for questions until the very end.
Thank you very much. And as a bit of a caveat, I'm not used to using PowerPoint, so there might be a bit of a disconnect at times between what I'm saying and where we're at with the slides. But thank you very much for having invited me and for joining us today. Maybe to start off with, yes, I mean, we are 17 months into a conflict, one of the worst humanitarian disasters on the planet right now. It is the only country in the world where famine has been declared in years, in the Zamzam IDP camp, which hosts around 500,000 people. As we speak, so famine was declared in August, there is still not a single UN convoy which have arrived in the Zamzam IDP camp. Not a single UN convoy in the only place on earth where famine is unfolding. Humanitarian catastrophe in terms of the number of people who have been displaced internally multiple times. I was asked at a briefing of the Security Council on Friday, so where is safe? And if you listen to stories of Sudanese, they have moved from one location to another again and again and again as the conflict has spread. So yes, I would say willfully overlooked conflict, but obviously not a forgotten conflict, as you've mentioned, and I think it does discredit to the amazing Sudanese diaspora, but also Sudanese on the ground, and I will come to some of them. As you might have seen in the last few weeks, the Sudanese emergency response rooms were nominated for the Nobel Prize. I personally feel they should have won the prize. And they have basically been, in many ways, the only heroes of the story for many years, going back to the revolution. But maybe to speak a bit about our work. When the conflict started in Khartoum, we knew that there would be hotspots where abuses were most likely to happen. And one of those areas was West Darfur. So West Darfur was a state where since 2019, we had already been investigating attacks on civilians there. It's an area where we saw a direct correlation between the removal of peacekeeping forces. Now, there were peacekeepers in Darfur up until 2020, and this dates back obviously to the campaigns of ethnic cleansing which happened in the early 2000s in Darfur. The government, and including the transitional government, which was this joint civilian military government, started to put pressure at the Security Council level to withdraw the peacekeepers from Darfur. They first withdrew from El Geneina, the capital of West Darfur, in mid-2019. By late 2019, we were starting to see very bad attacks on civilians inside El Geneina town itself. So we traveled to eastern Chad, which borders West Darfur, in June and then again in July last year, where we interviewed over 200 survivors, witnesses, aid workers who were trying to respond to what would be, by the end of last year, the influx of 500,000 people just fleeing abuses in West Darfur. Oh, sorry, here we go, I've already lost track of the, and so this is Eastern Chad. If you look at this, these were the conditions at the beginning of the influx into Eastern Chad. This is very, very east of Chad, very desertic. This was a tiny community to start with, who suddenly saw the arrival of hundreds of thousands of people. It's also a difficult context to get humanitarian aid to. There's a massive underfunding of humanitarian programming more generally in Chad. So this is where people were arriving when my colleagues started to investigate what had been happening. Eventually, after months of research, we reported on an attack in one town in West Darfur, Mestere town, where in the space of just 24 hours, the Rapid Support Forces, so former Janjaweed, that had become an official military force in Sudan, which is part of the complexities here. You basically had a structure of the security apparatus very much a remnants of the Bashir era, where you had the Rapid Support Forces, which had the same status as the Sudanese armed forces. And this was at the crux of the tensions which really started in late 2022 between the two generals at the head of these two forces. So Rapid Support Forces conducted horrific attacks in Mestere, completely decimated the town. Now, I do want to give you a sense of how very quickly what we were seeing were once again those images of fighters descending on towns and razing them to the ground. You know, these are not images from the past, these are images that once again have been happening in Darfur in the last 2 years. We then reported in a big report, the Masalit will not come home. So for 7 weeks, Rapid Support Forces carried out waves of attacks again and again on the predominantly Masalit neighborhood of the town of El Geneina, which is the capital of this region. Killing civilians, attacking civilian infrastructure. They destroyed internally displaced camps, which were where the Masalit community had been living for the last 2 decades, having fled previous cycles of abuse and atrocities in this town. Within the context of these killings, they also committed many other abuses: torture, widespread sexual violence. They apparently targeted community leaders. So they went after members of the government, activists, human rights reporters, journalists, really targeting also the very basis of the Masalit community in that town. So this went on for 7 weeks. By mid-June, and I'll come to what happened in mid-June, the Sudanese Red Crescent in the town had stopped counting how many bodies they were having to pick up. Now, the number of 15,000 is for the whole of Sudan. Our research suggests that we're probably talking about at least half of those killed in Encina, just showing how much of an underestimation 15,000 is. So by mid-June, the Sudanese Red Crescent stopped counting, and then suddenly the killings escalated. The governor of the town, who was last seen in the custody of the West Darfur commander of the Rapid Support Forces, Joma, and I will come back to him. So the governor was seen in his custody, and then what circulated a few hours later, very widely shared, were horrific videos of the bodies of the governor. And so on that night, tens of thousands of community members basically started fleeing the town. And we collected these testimonies of kilometre long of people trying to flee the town. And as they fled, they were once again attacked. Horrific testimonies of people being pulled out of cars, shot, injured people who've been injured in previous bouts of violence, in wheelbarrows, in carts being pulled out and massacred all along the way to eastern Chad. It's a 30-kilometre stretch of road, and people were killed the whole way. So this was when the report came out, many different testimonies, including of this human rights activist who had been trying throughout the 7 weeks of violence to keep track of what was happening on attacks on hospitals, healthcare facilities. What you see here is MSF. So MSF were one of the first organizations. They already had a certain base in eastern Chad. But the influx of people who were injured with trauma injuries was so enormous that they had to set up these makeshift clinics as people were coming in. One of the testimonies of the killing along the convoy, which I think will stay with all of us, I didn't do the testimony myself, but will always stay with us, is the testimony of Jamal, who was 17 years old, who had been shot during the early phases of the fighting in Encina. And so on the day that everyone was fleeing the town, the Masalit and non-Arab communities, his mum had to put him in a wheelbarrow. And then in the mayhem that ensued as the convoy came under attack, he was separated from his mother. And he basically describes seeing 17 people pulled up by Rapid Support Forces, shot, half of them were children, and then thrown into a river just on the outskirts of town. He was then arrested, detained, subjected to horrible conditions. Eventually, the Rapid Support Forces released him, and he managed to make it to eastern Chad. But I think, the colleagues who were part of this research, our Sudan researcher, but also researchers from our crisis division, who've obviously seen many, many horrific contexts, described how there wasn't a single person they spoke to who hadn't witnessed horrific crimes, who hadn't lost a loved one in those weeks of horror. They continued. So not only did they kill as people were leaving, they then erased the neighborhoods where the Masalit had been living for 20 years. And I think for me, this is one of the most stark evidence of what we have described and found to be a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Was if you look at the map of Encina in the early 2000s, so before the ethnic cleansing campaign under Bashir, and you look at the map today, they have erased all the neighborhoods where the Masalit had been living for the last 20 years. The town has radically shrunk. And here, so this is basically all the neighborhoods you see here were either burnt to the ground. We continued to interview people. Some women in particular tried to go back from eastern Chad into the town to try and collect some belongings. And they told us how they would go home, even the tiling, the roofing, the doors, everything was pillaged once they left. And then we saw from satellite imagery after the June attacks how the RSF brought in bulldozers and basically razed what was left of habitations in that town. So making very clear that those populations were not going home ever. So what we described in our report are crimes against humanity. including rape, murder, forced displacement and persecution, and of course widespread war crimes, which were part of a campaign of ethnic cleansing targeting not only the ethnic Masalit community, which were one of the majority communities in West Darfur, but also non-Arab populations. So when this report came out, was just around the time that the RSF started a new offensive against another town in Darfur. And I won't go into the details of that, I'm very happy to answer questions, but this is the town of El Fasher in North Darfur, a multicultural town which has also hosted years and years and years of internally displaced communities. It's also a very strategic town and implicates Chad. It's a very complex town. But since May, basically, there have been very, very heavy fighting in that town. And the Zamzam IDP camp is just next to El Fasher and is right now, as I said, in a condition of famine, but the only slightly safe haven for civilians in that area. So when this came out, we were warning, this has happened now in El Janeina. The world cannot let this happen in El Fasher as well. I will come back to a bit of the response which did end up happening and has been happening, but obviously to a certain extent in vain. But obviously Darfur hasn't been the only place. Khartoum has seen 18 months of fighting. Now, Khartoum was this vibrant town, city. So there's Khartoum, there's two sister cities as well, Omdurman and Bahri. About 6.5 million people live there. And since the get-go, you have seen fighting. The Rapid Support Forces took over control of many parts of Khartoum at the beginning. And within the context of those occupations, we've documented widespread sexual violence. We released, so this was El Fasher, we released a report in July, Khartoum is not safe for women, where we document widespread rape, gang rape. A lot of this is happening in the context of occupation of civilian homes, so in front of family members. We've also documented forced marriage and child marriage of women and girls in the town. We did also document cases of sexual violence by the Sudanese armed forces once they started to regain control of certain areas of Khartoum. So right now, as we speak, in the last few weeks, the Sudanese armed forces have started again an offensive on Khartoum. Shelling, I mean, Khartoum was really the center of Sudan for all services. So all the health services in Sudan were in Khartoum. And within the weeks of the conflict, the shelling, the complete disregard for trying to protect civilian property, etc., meant that about 80% of healthcare facilities in Sudan were not functioning properly. So what the report on sexual violence looked at was not only the horrific trends, but also the medical consequences on survivors, but also how the behavior of warring parties, notably the attacks on healthcare, is also preventing survivors from accessing care. The Sudanese armed forces have basically blockaded humanitarian assistance in Khartoum. So, as I said, a town which probably now has about 3 million people, very difficult to give a real sense because of lack of data, but they, throughout the period we were reporting, so up until February, they were not letting any medical supplies in. There'd been months and months and months of no medical supplies going in. The UN is not in Khartoum. The UN only got access to little parts of Omdurman when the Sudanese armed forces started to gain control. So as you understand from that, the UN is basically relying on the go-ahead from the Sudanese armed forces to basically enter this town. The only actors who've been in Khartoum are Médecins Sans Frontières, who've been running hospitals, but at massive cost. What we've been seeing is the Rapid Support Forces in particular have been occupying health facilities, have been going in, harassing healthcare workers. In our report, we also found instances of sexual violence against healthcare workers when they were trying to respond to survivors of sexual violence. The list goes on. The situation is devastating, and I would say in this this mix of lack of attention and reporting on Sudan, there is a massive underreporting on the situation in Khartoum. Since then, and I would say we've been using mixed methodology. It's a very, very difficult research environment. So yes, we spoke to direct witnesses when in Eastern Chad, where they could much more easily flee. A lot of people have been fleeing internally. We don't have access at the moment. There has started to be some international media who have accessed Sudan, but they do so under the auspices of the Sudanese armed forces. Which obviously has a massive impact in terms of how they are doing their interviews, who they are allowed to interview. What we've done here, so for the report on sexual violence, we interviewed service providers, so local responders, emergency rooms volunteers, so the ones who were basically nominated for the Nobel Prize. These basically came out of the revolution in 2018 and 2019. You had resistance committees at the local level, especially in Khartoum, but in many towns throughout Sudan, who were mobilizing to protest against the Bashir regime, but who also increasingly served as, I would say, a parallel state. As the state in Sudan was more and more corrupt, offered less and less services, these emergency response rooms were basically providing healthcare. When the conflict started, they basically shifted into these sort of emergency response room volunteers. So you have doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, and just ordinary people who are the ones who are providing soup kitchens in Khartoum, who are trying to respond to sexual violence, for example, running around the town, under shelling, and I'm not exaggerating here, trying to get rape kits to survivors. Sorry, I've lost my focus a bit here, but what we did with the sexual violence piece was to interview them so that we could also understand the sort of challenges they have been facing, because they haven't received the attention they need. The humanitarian community has continued to raise concerns about the challenges and the attacks they have faced. There have been a lot of attacks, massive pillaging of humanitarian assistance throughout the conflict, but you've not seen that level of attention on those who are really the ones responding to the humanitarian needs right now in Sudan. So that was for the sexual violence piece. We've also just put out 2 pieces where we use open source material. The executions piece for me, on the right, sorry, is just telling of the context of impunity. If there is one country in the world where impunity is so central to where we are today, it is Sudan. And what we saw here was that both warring parties started to put online videos of themselves torturing detainees, executing detainees. In the case of the Sudanese armed forces, we also saw them mutilating dead bodies. Horrible material. We obviously didn't make it public, but it just shows how both sides. We have incidents throughout the country, in the Kurdistans, in Darfur, in Khartoum. So this isn't under one commander, under one specific context. This is happening throughout. We then also released a piece which is looking at the ongoing flow of new weapons into Sudan. Now, it's a very technical piece. I'm not an expert at all, but what's very clear is there is new technology, new weapons which are ending up in the hands of both warring parties. As you know, one of the big elephants in the room on Sudan has been the involvement of the UAE. The UAE have been found by the UN panel of experts to have provided weapons to the rapid support forces who have been, as we've documented, committing crimes against humanity. There has been repeated messaging by many leaders in the world for the backers of the warring parties to stop, but we have not seen public action. We have not seen the Security Council actually publicly calling out the UAE for breaking what is an arms embargo on Sudan. So this piece finds that basically there are new weapons from Iran, from Russia, from UAE, which have arrived in Sudan since the conflict started. So is all this work in vain, given where we are today, 18 months in? And I think, just to highlight a few of the points here about how hard it is not to think that it is a fundamentally racist response from the world. President Biden hardly spoke about Sudan until last month in Unga. 16 months of all of this happening, and he hardly even mentioned it. The Secretary General this week Friday, tweeted immediately when the IPC, who are the ones who determine the food insecurity status of a country, reported on Gaza. He did not tweet when famine was declared in Sudan. So we are seeing a level of a lack of the file. The file is receiving attention. It's not receiving the sort of concerted, high-level attention which is needed because of the gravity of what we're talking about, but also because of the complex geopolitical realities of this conflict as well. I would say we have seen some movement. So this was the first piece we put out on West Darfur. One of our key calls then was for the International Criminal Court, which had been investigating events in Darfur since the early 2000s. We called on them to ensure their investigations looked into the new crimes. And then in July, during a biannual briefing to the Security Council, the ICC prosecutor announced that he would be also looking into the crimes which have happened since then. We've also been calling for the individual targeted sanctioning. Now, we firmly believe that individual sanctions is not a form of an accountability, but it's obviously part of a strategy of consequences for actions. The US started, and the EU has also sanctioned the West Darfur RSF commander, specifically because of the human rights abuses. There have been many other entities that have now been sanctioned because of their support to the war, but not explicitly because of human rights abuses. We're now pushing for the Security Council to actually endorse sanctions as well on some of these individuals, and there are discussions ongoing as we speak. Obviously, a much stronger message if there is a global sanctioning of the individuals responsible for these heinous crimes. When the West Darfur report came out, I would say this is a moment where there was some media reporting, and quite a lot, and it was because of this mix, I would say, of the reporting we were putting out, coming out, but also El Fasher exploding, and a real concern that if El Fasher really, really became worse, this could lead to a regional conflict. So one of our key calls was for the deployment of a new protection of civilian mission to Sudan. For us, it is very clear that there is a need for police, military, civilian forces on the ground right now in Sudan, because nowhere is safe for civilians. Even those who are trying, the local responders, they are doing this at such great risk that there needs to be an international or regional presence. Now, when we put out this report, eyebrows used to roll when we would say we need a mission on the ground. No one thought it was remotely even worth talking about. That has shifted. We've seen more and more groups, ICG, all sorts of think tanks who initially were not even speaking about it, starting to acknowledge that there is a need for a physical protection mission on the ground. There have been Sudanese, more and more, who've been very vocal about this. A lot of discussions around the lessons learned of previous peacekeeping missions and how you could build on that in the current context as well. In June, the UK, so the UK is the pen holder on Sudan at the Security Council, which means they draft the resolutions, etc. They got a resolution through, and I say that because the dynamics are very complicated. You have a tendency at the Security Council to see the African 3 members who support the position of Sudan, which does, Sudan linked to SAF, who don't want any international scrutiny, attention on Sudan. And then you often have Russia and China who back the A3 position. So it's very difficult to get anything through the Security Council right now in Sudan. But they did manage in June because of the fear of what was happening in El Fasher in particular. And explicitly, the resolution called on the Secretary General to come up with a plan to protect civilians. So we've been seizing on that, doing lots and lots of advocacy around that, consultations with Sudanese groups, trying to see where the discussion could go. Now it's timely because today his report went to the Security Council. This is an embargoed copy. It's disappointing, which we are not surprised by, unfortunately. There has been, and I think to come back to the whole discussion here about the willingness to really see a concerted international response on African conflicts. There has been again and again a tendency by the UN to take a step back and to say the African Union should lead on this. He does mention a reference to the calls from many, many actors for a protection of civilian mission, but then he caveats it by saying that the environment is not conducive for a protection of civilian mission. The environment we're speaking about is obviously the political environment. So obviously we hope to seize on that and to encourage actors who do believe. So the US has been pressing a lot, and maybe to the discussion we can have after about what can individuals do, what can be done right now. I think it is critical in the last few months of the Biden administration to press at the highest levels for there to be a diplomatic push right now to see the deployment of a mission. Obviously, this has to be in collaboration with the African Union, and so what we've been encouraging states to do is to have those discussions. There are countries on the ground. South Africa, just last week, voted in favor of the renewal of an investigation into Sudan. This is the first time South Africa has ever gone against what was the sort of state position on a resolution. Sudan didn't want this mechanism to remain in place. South Africa supported the ongoing investigations, as did Ghana. There are opportunities and we think they need to be seized, but that is really going to require a massive, massive diplomatic push. So voices. Politicians need to hear that people care. This is obviously something we've also been trying to engage the new UK government, because the UK has the pen at the Security Council, has the pen in Geneva on Sudan, so they are a critical actor, obviously with a very important Sudanese diaspora as well. So I don't want to end on a note of hope, because I think, if anything, I'm always admired to see many Sudanese who continue to fight, quite literally, on risking their lives for a better Sudan. It's hard to be hopeful at the moment. I think, generally speaking, the work we do makes us, it's an existential moment, more broadly, but I think it is important to see that everyone can make a bit of a difference, and I think there are some opportunities here in the US, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the both of you for sharing so much about your work, both in historical perspective and what we are doing now to address what's going on in Sudan. I think it's really, really important to recognize the identity and affinity making that African Americans are doing in terms of still identifying with the history of the region, as well as where perhaps news agencies are missing the mark in terms of not elevating the crisis to a point where there's actually legible action being taken. So thank you again for your thoughts on this matter. And so with that, we'll open up for questions.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. Please introduce yourself. So I'm a PhD student here at Stanford. I'm Sudanese. I'm just Sudanese, and I mean saying just Sudanese because I can see I've lived my whole life in Sudan, and I just came here to the US like 3 years ago to study. So I'm just Sudanese, I'm not Sudanese American, I'm not Sudanese diaspora. And I want you to make this distinction because I can see that the Sudanese diaspora are viewing these issues very differently than us, the people who are actually coming from there. I'm sorry, but this is just very personal to me. My family was actually there when the war started, and they had to flee Khartoum, and then they had to leave the country to survive. And our house is currently occupied by RSF soldiers. So I had like a first-hand experience with all of this, at least in Khartoum. And the way I hear you talk about this sounds very different than the way we are talking about it, than my friends and my family and my neighborhood, the people in my neighborhood are talking about it actually. Like you're talking about warring generals or two parties fighting each other, or needing like a commission, or talking about the historical and the historical background of all of this. This region that is called Sudan now is like a post-colonial country, which wasn't called Sudan before 1965 or 1956, I don't know. This region has had this composition, like this ethnic and religious composition since I don't know when, and it has never seen something like what's happening now. Like we know we are very aware that we have a lot of internal problems that we need to consider and think about, but what's happening right now, the way we view it, is kind of different than the way you describe it now. We are sorry, my phone started so when you talk about warring generals or point parties, or no place is safe in Sudan, or we have to deploy like a mission to Sudan. Actually, the Sudanese people I personally know are against this, because we basically doubt the intention of all international entities that are actually calling for something like this. Because one of the main things that are actually leading to whatever is happening to us right now is some very strong US allies supporting this war by providing daily weapons to RSF to do whatever it's doing to us right now. But when I come here, I hear you talking about no place is safe. Actually, my family, when RSF attacked the neighborhood, my family had to flee the neighborhood to another neighborhood that is controlled by SAF, by the Sudanese army, because it's simply way safer. Because they know that even if there are some crimes here and there, but they are not systematic, they are not widespread. So the chance of you surviving and not having to go through all of this is like so much high when you are in an army-controlled place than when you are in an RSF-controlled place. People actually, all the internally displaced people in Sudan right now go from RSF areas to SAF to armies-controlled areas. So why do they do that? Because these parties are not equal, but you keep talking about them as being equal, and we think, I am one of the people, and a lot of people like me think that this is something, this is a story that a lot of people they want to promote because there is some agenda behind it. It's not like pure, oh, those people are all, like both of them are just bad people and they want to do that. No, actually. The army-controlled areas right now are way safer, and you can find like medical access to medical care facilities. Your children can go to schools. You can at least know that no one will rape your girl. Like the chance of this happening is just very small in armies-controlled areas. And when people,
No, I apologize for interrupting. I know we're beginning to get short on time. I wanted to say thank you for sharing. I think it's really important to hear these personal responses that come from a place where we may not know otherwise. I think your comments are really, really important, and we appreciate them. I don't know if you want to respond now or take a couple of more questions beforehand. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Well, I was curious, and it's sort of related to this, to understand more deeply what are the broader geopolitical forces that are there. So when you talk about, China or the UAE, you said, right, like, is it, I would presume there's some link here to resource extraction or interest in that. So I'm curious about the broader interests, geopolitical interests that always serves as factors in sort of fomenting violence and
I have a couple of questions. One is following up on your Penelope's. I heard and I read somewhere about like UAE's other efforts. UAE's mindset is generally like in the Muslim majority world, like there is the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots, and whoever is against them, they just support them because they are like anti-Islamist first and foremost. So how does that play, if that is also the case here, how does that play in this setting? Like what is really, also like I read about New York Times, I think reported that they also set up a hospital in Chad, and that was basically taking care of not the Sudanese people, civilians, but the fighters of RSF, and they were branding it as Red Crescent, even worse. So any thoughts about that? Like any studies that confirm those allegations? And another is a more conceptual question. So we have been using genocide a lot, like last couple of years, and not always, in a well-placed manner. Like in terms of the human rights community, like these are very important distinctions between genocide and ethnic cleansing, like happened in, for instance, Armenians were ethnically cleansed from Artsakh, or genocide or massacre. So we have these different terms. And in our conversations before this event with Laetitia, so I raised the issue, like, can we call it genocide? It was mostly because the fact that Masalit were literally, like, Masalit men, especially men, even like when they are 7 years old, they were massacred one by one. They were targeted distinctively, and also what I heard is they were raping the mother and saying, now you are going to have an Arab boy or Arab kid. So doesn't that count, like as genocide, as a textbook case? That is the second question. Thank you.
I'd like to take this.
I'll start. First of all, I think it is absolutely fair to be skeptical of certainly outside states and their intervention in the conflict. And I think that skepticism is actually connected to the geopolitical importance of Sudan, right? Sudan used to be one of the really breadbaskets of the region, the Nile, right? With the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, there's been a lot of concern over control of the Nile, namely Egypt, right? And so Egypt in this conflict has been very much on the side of the SAF, right? The Red Sea, right? I believe 10% of the world's commercial shipping goes through the Red Sea. And so there are lots of both African and non-African actors that are very invested in an outcome that, let's just be real, is favorable for them economically, right? And so I do think that it is absolutely fair for Sudanese to be skeptical of kind of outside intervention and whether those actors are more concerned about people, right, or about economic interests, right? So I absolutely, I empathize with that. And then lastly, I think with the framing of kind of, it's not just two people, I do agree with that. I think that there are, as you know, there are so many, splinter groups on the ground, right? There's the SPLM North, towards the South Sudan border, right? I will say that I think as dangerous as the RSF has been, I will say that, at least before basically the violence broke out last April, I know that Burhan was taking lots of heat because, of his involvement in basically, the crackdown of protesters, and I guess the perception that he was not open to SAF being accountable for their past actions. And then, yes, I do believe that genocide is an appropriate word, but I think that one of the things that makes it really dangerous or potentially risky at this day and age is because of what was basically Arab demonization that occurred during the Darfur genocide of 03 and 04, right? Which of course was in the wake of kind of the beginning of the war on terror, right? And, as some people have talked about, Sudanese Arabs were really demonized as part of a larger anti-Arab agenda, right? Where basically, Sudanese Arabs were being lumped in with lots of other kind of, groups. And so I would imagine that some in the media are very hesitant to use that word so as not to appear to be anti-Arab all over again. But I think that that's where ethnicity comes into play, and when certain ethnic groups are being targeted and that type of language that you're using is being used, it's hard to see how it cannot be. So.
Maybe, and thanks for your questions. I think, in terms of, we're not in the balancing act, and I think, we're not diplomats, and I think one of the concerns with the response so far is there's been a tendency to want to each time balance in terms of responses, in terms of sanctioning, in terms of, we have undoubtedly put out many more reports documenting widespread abuses by the rapid support forces, be it in Darfur or be it in Khartoum. Now, having said that, we've also documented what are, violations of international humanitarian law, and in the cases of the executions, for example, war crimes by the Sudanese armed forces. In Durman, we documented sexual violence by the Sudanese armed forces. Obviously, food is being allowed in because they are not blockaded on Durman. So again, that's the willful obstruction of humanitarian assistance, which they've been doing in RSF-controlled parts of Khartoum. And as you know, right now the humanitarian context in Baki, is just horrific as a result of it. So there are also violations and crimes which have been committed by SAF, and we have documented them. But we definitely don't believe in sort of balancing and needing to say both parties when it's not both parties. We've put out reports. This is explicitly about rapid support forces and the Arab militia there. But of course, these are important lived realities, and again, those voices need to be heard. And I think, one of the concerns again, and I think it's a tricky moment here, because if I also understand the skepticism, the concern with international involvement. From our point of view, there's a lot of mistakes which have been made in Sudan just in the last few years. And I think in terms of the response to the coup, for example, in terms of the inability of the international community to find ways to support social movements on the ground in a way which doesn't impose agendas, in a way that doesn't put them at risk. And for me, that's where, at the moment where we're at right now, you'll see the Secretary General report when it comes out. He's underscoring again the role of local responders, but the truth is you cannot let them, it's massive. The risks to local responders is absolutely enormous right now, and that is from both sides. There's been arrests, unlawful detentions by the Sudanese armed forces and by the rapid support forces, and so, it's a big question on Sudan. How do you support, protect local systems without leaving them in this vacuum of danger, and without imposing agendas? So I agree. It's very complex, and I think this is why all these stories need to come out. But with the communication shut down, with the risks, I mean, the emergency response rooms initially were much more vocal about the risks they were facing. They had to be silenced because basically both sides were harassing them, and they had to stop the reporting. And so it's very complicated. The UAE elephant in the room, of course, is an enormous one, and it is one as an organisation. We've just been joining efforts around the NBA. The NBA have just gone and played 2 days in the UAE. There are several groups calling for a boycott. We were saying that it's absolutely essential that the NBA is speaking out about the abuses, both domestic in the UAE, but obviously also the support to the rapid support forces in Sudan. So this is obviously, the problem is, and this may be, last point from me in terms of geopolitics, and again, how you elevate this agenda is that, the marching orders of certain governments at the moment with the UAE, Sudan is not the priority. Gaza is the priority, or, the broader debates with China, etc., are the priority, and so Sudan is always maybe agenda item number 5, which sort of gets mentioned. Oh, we're very worried about Sudan, and this is what we're operating with as well at the sort of high-level policy area as well. Genocide, but very difficult question, which I have to get my talking points out on because I am not a lawyer myself. But I mean, in our report, many debates internally. In the end, we didn't find that it constituted genocide, but we in no way proclaim that this doesn't mean that genocide hasn't happened, and it's why we continue to push for ongoing investigations into what happened in West Darfur, of course. And it really came down to the whole issue of the intent to destroy in part or as a full, as being the driver rather as potentially the consequences. So, of course, a lot of the crimes that were committed also could constitute genocidal acts, but we did not find the sort of intent to destroy as being the lead factor. The destruction was happening with the potentiality of destroying in part or whole, but not as the kind of driving force. And so it is very complicated, but it's also why we say that investigations need to continue, and the ICC is obviously investigating what the events in West Darfur, and we hope we'll do a good job.
Magnolia?
Thank you. Thank you for shedding light on what's happening. I'm to the student line as well. I have a question. The presentation you're both giving is framed from the perspective of the international community, the West, America, Europe, the UK, what they're doing or not doing. But I was wondering if you could contextualize what is happening on the continent and what the regional approaches are, what the African Union is doing, or not doing, or not able to do. I'm also interested in South Africa's role or South Africa's response to what's happening in Sudan, especially given that they have been a leader in trying to hold Israel accountable at the International Criminal Court. And yet, South Africa itself on the continent as a sort of leader that has failed in several conflicts to allow necessary response to take place in places like Zimbabwe, but also in relation to Sudan when Omar al-Bashir was ousted and fled to South Africa, and at the time the ICC had issued an arrest warrant for him, and South Africa had the opportunity to arrest him, but decided that they would not because they wanted to handle the affairs domestically or using other mechanisms. And I'm curious about what those look like, if they're happening, what the conversations and frameworks are in relation to the Sudan conflict.
So I can start. So one of the organizations that has been involved in mediation efforts on the continent is the acronym is IGAD. It's the Intergovernmental, and of course the A and D. I forget what those means, what those, yes, authority, thank you so much. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is basically like an East African regional bloc, consisting of like Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, as well as South Sudan. What is concerning a bit about that is that two members of IGAD are themselves very autocratic. So Salva Kiir, who is the president of South Sudan, himself within South Sudan has delayed elections multiple times. He's got a list of kind of, human rights abuses connected to himself. The president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, has been in power since 1987, right? And so in a sense, you have autocratic leaders who are now coming up to help mediate this conflict. And I think it kind of lends itself to wondering, well, are they the appropriate parties who can do this, right? What are their potential agendas, right? Egypt has also been involved in mediation efforts, right? But Egypt is led by al-Sisi, who himself has been in power for over a decade, is a career kind of military official, right? And Egypt has had its own issues with freedom of the press and, oppression of political opponents, right? Not on the African continent itself, but just across the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia has also been involved, right, in mediation efforts. I think from a historical standpoint, one of the tricky components about African state participation in mediation efforts has been a sense of, because of the history of European colonialism, we really want to handle affairs internally, right? But many of the African states involved themselves are led by kind of one-party states, right? And so there's a sense of kind of skepticism about what might their priorities be, right? And the last point, the African Union, right, which is a direct offshoot of the Organization of African Unity, right, very much a, kind of post-colonial, Pan-African invention. Well, it's headquartered just next door in Ethiopia, right? And so just from a public relations standpoint, at least from my standpoint, but I, stand to be corrected, the AU does not look particularly good thus far because it has been unsuccessful in really being able to have a kind of palpable impact on mediation efforts. And that's not to blame other African parties for the conflict. It's just to say that I think one can be very skeptical of the local state actors at play, namely Egypt, Uganda, and South Sudan.
If I could just, on the whole issue of solidarity, we've also not seen much solidarity in the region. And for me, it was the same on the conflict on Ethiopia. We did not see sort of regional NGOs mobilizing about the horrors that were unfolding in the conflict there. And we've not seen that so much on Sudan. We've seen some mobilization by former female presidents, for example, writing about the sexual violence trends. We've seen some groups. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights is meeting as we speak now. There's been several events on Sudan which have been happening there. So we have seen some regional NGOs, domestic NGOs, which are raising the issue, but it's hardly in the media either on the continent. So, this sort of lack of solidarity is not just in the kind of, outside of the continent, it's also on the continent. In terms of the African Union, and I totally agree, I was actually just this morning on calls all morning trying to figure out our next steps in terms of engagement. So Museveni has for what it's worth, been the only head at the level of the heads of state who's really pushed on Sudan. And in June, at the same time there was this resolution of the Security Council, there was actually a convening in Kampala, which led to a resolution where they, so the African Union Peace and Security Council called on the African Union Commission to put together a plan on protection of civilians. Now, same time as this one, that has not moved forward. And Museveni, in that same statement, there was a call for a heads of state level convening to happen. So it's a sort of C5, so it's heads of states from the 5 areas of the continent who were supposed to meet on the 23rd of October, and I found out just this morning they've cancelled the meeting. So a lot of work went into getting Al-Sisi, who was supposed to be one of the presidents at that meeting. It got cancelled because Burhan basically refused to come. And so, you know, you have had some efforts, definitely. I think one of the problems is at the level of the AUC, the chairperson is up for renewal, so it's an election period. The chairperson, Faki, has in the past been quite strong on Sudan, has completely washed his hands of the file, so there really isn't leadership at that level. And, you know, on South Africa, President Ramaphosa actually put out a strong statement the day before his re-election about El Fasher. It was the first time we'd really seen them speaking out. Who is very strong in South Africa is Mbeki. He's still the head of the Sudan panel. He's continued to convene meetings to try and push. He's put out his own statements, but obviously he's a former president. He hasn't been given any official role in the new dispensation. There is a panel on Sudan, again, which was established because of Uganda's pushing. So Uganda has tried to move things. But to the point again, you then have individual politics. You've had the AU that's been very annoyed about some of the US, Swiss, Saudi Arabia track on negotiations which have been happening because initially they weren't invited. So it's a lot about on all levels, that's been a bit of an issue. And then IGAD, initially IGAD was very forthcoming. President Ruto of Kenya in particular was very, very open. But the Sudanese armed forces, again, just as they're now doing of the Ugandans, blamed Kenya for being pro-UAE. There's dynamics between Ethiopia and Kenya on Sudan. So right now, IGAD is rather sidelined in the whole dispensation. But from my point of view, that's why you need to have a cross-continental engagement, because of course neighbouring states have more interests, say their own concerns. I mean, there's a massive influx of refugees into Uganda as well. It's not just on the bordering countries as well. So we've just not seen the leadership anywhere. We've just not seen, that's what you need. You need a few people to take on the file and we've just not been seeing that on the African continent either.
I believe Dr. Hassan would like to have the last question, but I'm sure you can chat with others as you get up and mill about, so go ahead.
Yes, thank you both for your presentation. So I was actually in Sudan in 2019 at the National Records Office in Khartoum, where I did some of my archival research, and that was the last time I was in Sudan. And when this conflict started, I continued to speak to some of my teachers. Some of them taught me Arabic manuscript there in Sudan, and it's really painful and quite pathetic listening to what is unfolding, some of which you discussed. I would love to start with the issue of solidarity that you mentioned, and then I have a question about the theft of artifacts, particularly by the RSF. On the issue of solidarity, I know, so I study the histories and cultures of Muslim society, and I know that in North Nigeria, where I came from, there's been a lot of solidarity for Sudan. Also because of the historical connection between Northern Nigeria and Sudan. During the period of colonialism, when some of the scholars and Northern Nigerians migrated out of the region because of the conquest of the British, and they moved to Sudan. From Sudan, some of them moved to Hijaz. So ever since this conflict started, there's been a lot of solidarity. The Muslim scholars have been delivering khutbah, talking about the issue of Sudan. And in fact, I remember before the conflict, I think this was last year, they held a conference at BUK, Barrio University Kano. It was all about Sudan, Hassan Turabi. It was all about Sudan, Hassan Turabi, and so there's a lot of like solidarity, and not just even in northern Nigeria. I mean, in places like Mali, I think I've seen about two khutbah from theological scholars speaking about Sudan. So I think much of this solidarity has not been probably maybe popularized in the media, but I can tell you that especially in the Muslim community, there's a lot of solidarity to Sudan. And then talking about the issue of looting of artifacts, I mean, there's been a lot of allegation about the RSF looting artifacts, and some of these artifacts have been auctioned in black market and also been sold as well. I mean, possibly some of them are going to land in the archives and libraries of Western institutions. I wanted to speak about this particular issue of theft of artifacts, and if it's possible, I mean, can we really? I don't have a full scale of the theft, but I'm thinking about it in the case of what happened in Iraq, where after the conquest of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, even New York Times actually participated in the theft as well. I mean, New York Times gathered several files. I mean, I remember that at the time there was a lot of protests against Rukmini Callimachi of New York Times because she gathered all of these files. They brought them to the program of countering extremism at George Washington University, where some of those files were housed, and Iraqis never had access to them. Are we seeing a replication of that same type of like looting of theft and artifacts? And how does this play into the larger conversation about the debate on restitution of bronzes, of art that we've seen, especially in places like Nigeria, the Benin bronzes, and the whole debate about restitution in general? Thank you.
Great question. I will focus mainly on the solidarity piece. I would love to chat with you, after we're officially done, because there's so much about Nigeria's relationship with Sudan and vice versa that I think are really compelling. Because actually, during the first Sudanese Civil War, right, from 1955 to 72, you had some South Sudanese activists really having allegiance with Biafra, right? Under this sense of, hey, we're two secessionist movements, we should, right? So I would just, love to talk with you, but I think that the solidarity piece cannot be understated, because I think one of the interesting facets to come out recently is this question of how does religious, or what might religious solidarity do to help bring an end to the conflict, right? And in particular, religious actors, right? So, how is the conflict being taught among Muslim communities in North Africa and throughout the Arab world, right? In addition, right, the Arab League, right, and Sudan's historical role in the Arab League. Right? One might say, well, the Arab League right now is really focusing heavily and primarily on what's happening in Gaza, right? The Arab League, like the African Union and like all international bodies, can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? It does not have to, focus 100% of its efforts on one catastrophe. It can focus on multiple, right? And so in some ways, I think that the Arab League, there is room to critique what inaction they have done since April 2023, right? Sudan is one of the oldest members of the Arab League, right?
Yeah, I can't really answer either. I mean, I think it's a fascinating point, but even in terms of, we've been hearing recently around some of the religious community leaders also negotiating sort of some spaces for protection of civilians, in sort of negotiating with the RSF as well. And so I think just thinking about how to tap into that and feed into that, I think would be fascinating. And I totally agree. I think these are areas and issues that go beyond what we see and what a lot of people see. But I think how to make those voices heard a bit more and how to feed those into discussions, I think is critical. I mean, obviously it's not playing out in terms of Nigeria's role on the conflict at all. I mean, they haven't at all taken up the file. It's something we've discussed multiple times, but I totally agree with the history and the affiliations, and it would make sense to do that. So I think it is something to think about a bit more. On the artifacts, it's not something we've documented at this point at all. I mean, the pillaging by the RSF has been, absolutely incredible, and the scale absolutely enormous. And it's loot of war, it's survival. Obviously, they're also operating in areas which are cut off at the moment, so that's how they are basically living off the population. But it plays out also on the artifacts as well. But it's not something we've done any research on, and I've not seen much good reporting on it generally so far. So I think it's absolutely. I was actually just looking at a report this morning we've done on that in another context, and thinking it would be an important piece of research as well. But we've not done it.
Thank you both for this very engaging conversation.